Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Jimmy Clovey. I'm the digital community manager here at the Media Strategist community, supporting you guys. I'm so excited to have today a returning guest, Dr. Robert Eiler, president of economic forensics and analytics at Sonoma State University, and uh, welcome and happy partner to the Media Strategist community on all things macroeconomics. We are here today to discuss really three things: tariffs, trade, and AI. Really, the three forces that are redefining America's economy. Dr. Eiler is obviously a economics expert and is here to present on really the trends and forces that are kind of changing the way that the entire supply chain is going to potentially react to the world in the next couple of years. With that being said, Dr. Eiler, I know you're here. Feel free to pop on um, when the get a name to the face before we jump in. Oh,
Yeah,
hey,
Jimmy, I'm here.
perfect. Hey, Rob, how are you?
I'm good.
All right. And really, we'll jump into the presentation, and then from there, we will do a Q&A, live Q&A. Folks are muted right now. Obviously, once we're out, you can feel free to unmute yourself. But other than that, I think we can jump into the presentation. So, welcome everybody, Dr. Robert Allen.
Thanks, Jimmy. And thanks, folks, for making the time this morning to talk about these issues. We're going to start right away with the American labor market. So if you look at the number of people who were working in the United States in November 2007 and make that number equal to 100, that's the evolution of the American labor market from November 2007 to when we actually recovered all the jobs lost in what we call the Great Recession. It took 78 months to get there. Now, the reason I start here is because if you look at January 2020 is kind of a date where the labor market started to make a move against what was coming with the pandemic. And then you can see the sharp cut after the job losses took place, the recovery period to get back to where we were in January 2020, and then moving above that. By using an index number, we can make those two start dates the same number and then see the evolution of both recessions, recoveries, and then ultimately what we've been in expansion since about mid 2022. We're about 4.6% above the seasonally adjusted number we were in January 2020 in terms of the total number of jobs in the United States. So that black line continues to creep up over time, and sometimes it beats analyst numbers and sometimes it doesn't. But the key is that as long as it continues to grow, we will not have a declared recession in the United States. Most forecasters look at the labor market as really kind of the signal as to whether or not the economy is declining or expanding. And as long as that black line keeps moving up and not toward the red dotted line, we won't have a recession. But I'll come back and talk about that with respect to the latest forecasts that I watch in terms of a blend of forecaster opinions and see that more in context then. One of the key issues, both politically and economically worldwide, but really has had a lot of focus in the United States and generally is seen as the reason why the Trump administration was elected, is this graph. So this graph is one representation of inflation, and it's the representation of inflation that the Federal Reserve uses when it thinks about interest rates, and it's called core personal consumption expenditures prices. So the way you should interpret this graph is the following. It starts in January 2007. It's seasonally adjusted on a monthly basis. And that blue solid line is the evolution of the percentage change in the cost of what we buy at home and everything we buy. It's meant to cover everything except for food and energy prices or energy products and services, which is why we call it core. So we strip those things out of the equation. We're left with a core basket of goods. And that December 2.8% suggests that it was 2.8% more expensive to buy that same stuff at home that we bought in December 2023 by the time we got to December 2024. So that annualized inflation rate is 2.8. Now, that looks relatively low, but we're going to see in a minute two things are happening. One is that the Federal Reserve wants to shape that blue solid line toward the blue dotted line, which is you can think of as sort of the baseline long-term expectations around inflation that the Federal Reserve wants to sort of hit. And for its own sort of prudence in terms of policy, it wants to push that number out and say, our policies are going to try to shape around that line. The red dots in that shaded area are the current forecast toward 2027 and in the end of 2027. So we want to see that blue line move through those red dots relatively smoothly if we can do it. But the key is that it actually curled up a little bit from its original descent. And we're going to come back and talk about what that means in just a second with respect to interest rates. But what's given a lot of stomach aches in policy circles and has not quite yet given a lot of policy or a lot of stomach aches in equity market circles is where are we going from here? So if that curl continues to kind of stabilize and not move toward those red dots, the Federal Reserve will not lower rates at the speed they were going to do 6 months ago. And that can change some equity market outcomes. It can change some bond market outcomes. And the financial markets are trying to weave their way through the expectations given the recent changes. Now, what's that mean? As I said, we'll talk in a minute about what that means for interest rates in 2025. But what might be a larger, I wouldn't say existential, because that's probably too hyperbolic for the situation. But let's just say that there's a lot of consternation around what are the sort of parallel policies to monetary policy, things like trade policy, fiscal policy. We saw the House pass a budget last night. What's that going to mean in terms of debt and the movement of bonds onto the market, which can have another effect on interest rates and ultimately on inflation, depending on how expansionary or contractionary that budget is. And they don't want it to contract. So if it expands, we're going to have this other reason for upward pressure on prices. How does that affect the way we think about interest rates and the path of policy to try to shape that blue solid line through those red dots? Now, I look at Fannie Mae, which is the government-sponsored organization that purchases 30-year fixed-rate mortgages from lenders in the United States when they conform to a certain rule book. It's the main reason we still have fixed interest rate mortgages in the United States is the existence of that organization and its sister organization called Freddie Mac. But they look at interest rates all the time, and what they are really, in kind of a colloquial way of saying it, is that they're basically like a mortgage hedge fund. So their ability to maintain profitability is very much dependent on their current look at interest rates, but really their forward look. This is their look at the policy rate. So that blue line is basically the Federal Reserve's quarterly average rate over the last couple of years from 2022 forward, and then ending in the last data point is quarter four 2024, and then moving down. So this graph is meant to tell you sort of two items. One, interest rates have dropped from their plateau at the height when we were trying to fight inflation. The Federal Reserve does believe it's actually cured some of the inflation, but not all. And thus, the idea is that we probably won't see as sharp a decline as we saw initially in the last couple quarters of 2024, moving toward the end of 2026. So right now, that policy rate, which is at 4.5%, is likely over the next 2 years to decline somewhere around, or decline to 3.5%, which means more or less 2 quarter-point rate cuts per year for the next 2 years. Now, these data came out about 5 weeks ago. So the new data are about to emerge from Fannie Mae again, and from a lot of different forecasters. There's a lot of rumblings now at Wall Street that the Federal Reserve is starting to show signs that we will only see one 25 basis point or 1/4% rate cut in 2025, and maybe only one in 2026 because of the graph we just looked at. If the inflation pressure is not sort of fading away from the changes we had in interest rates previously, we have to be cautious to think that the Federal Reserve is going to be aggressive to move rates down. Now, what that means is kind of a weird mixed bag of results. And this is where we're seeing a little bit of consternation again in equity markets, but not so much that we're seeing massive sell-offs. The black line on this graph is the 10-year Treasury security. And the 10-year Treasury security is the basis of long-term corporate debt and corporate lending in the United States. It's also the basis of our mortgage lending and housing markets. So the evolution of that black line tells a story about how those longer-term rates are going to change in terms of what banks could do with their money otherwise. They can either put it with the government at 10 years, or they can give it to you for a 30-year mortgage or for some 7 to 10-year corporate loan otherwise. That has actually kicked up a little bit. So the 10-year Treasury rate picking up is reflective of two items. Is one, we're seeing people move around on the yield curve and move toward the short end of it, which means that they actually are abandoning the long, and thus to sell longer term debt, you got to kick up that yield for investors. But the second is that investors want more inflation coverage. So the longer that inflation lingers at relatively high levels, the more the bond markets are going to start to price into their yields and ultimately the bond prices a higher amount of return for investors just to sell the debt. And that means mortgage rates will also not come down. So if you think about the blend of interest rates out there, the negative is that rates are not coming down at the speed we thought they would 6 months ago. The positive, which is somewhat hidden here, and you can see the crossing of the blue and the black line, is that the yield curve for government debt has actually got back to what you could think of as a more well-behaved form. So we should be paying higher yield or higher returns for longer-term debt. We have not been for a really long time, almost 2 years straight. We had what was called the yield curve inversion, which is problematic for lenders. That is now sort of reasserted the normality or the normal shape of a yield curve, which looks like a concave function. So we're watching this closely to see how this evolves. But for right now, the two items that you should be thinking about is one, we will not see longer term debt move down in terms of cost anytime soon. So if you're thinking about borrowing, if you're thinking about buying a home, your workers are thinking about buying a home, the cost of credit is not going to descend at the same speed we thought it would 6 months ago. And the Federal Reserve is also not going to move rates down as fast. However, that should make for more profitable outcomes for lenders in the end because that yield curve has flipped on toward a more well-behaved form. Let's now move to a couple of manufacturing indicators that forecasters use. First one is job openings in manufacturing. So job openings in manufacturing have descended from their peak after the pandemic. These data are thousands of job openings in manufacturing from the first quarter of 2002 through which should be the fourth quarter of 2024. So you can see that as we started to decline going toward the Great Recession, which is that second shaded area moving left to right, that signaled some recession pressure. Same thing happened as we were moving toward the pandemic, but you cannot say that job openings in manufacturing declining from a peak created the pandemic recession. However, what is now very foggy in people's minds is that a lot of economists were predicting a slower economy in 2020, having no knowledge of what was coming from the pandemic. So that signaled again that we were probably going into slower economic times. Whether it would have triggered a recession or not is unknown. But about 85 to 90% of the recessions we've seen since the Second World War were preceded by a downturn in job openings in manufacturing. And so forecasters tend to use this metric as a way of gauging another vector that's out there in the macroeconomy. And why that's important is because we've seen that decline. Now, Jamik and I, in a previous conversation, he had a really good question. He said, well, now, is this really something that we should be thinking is an abnormality in terms of that big peak in job openings in manufacturing? And if the recession around COVID had not happened, is this basically where we would be otherwise? And the answer is probably, in the sense that the trend was already declining. And if you would have just seen a pickup in the economy through either interest rate changes as we went into a slower economy, larger fiscal policy after the Biden administration was elected, we probably would be about the same place. So the key is there downhill pressure on these job openings regardless, which then suggests that we're starting to see a slower economy being signaled. And you can see that right now we're somewhere pre-COVID in terms of the current job openings in manufacturing. Now, parallel to that, we also tend to use what's known as the Institute for Supply Management's Purchasing Managers Index in terms of a really simple idea. Every month, ISM asks 100 purchasing managers, do you think things are getting better or do you think things are getting worse? If they're better, you get a 1. If it's worse, you get a 0. And this is meant to average those out over time. And then it's seasonally adjusted and shaped on a 6-month moving average. And this is where we are. So as of January 2025, we saw that pick up slightly, which is kind of hard to see. I put that arrow there so you can kind of see this little click up. But below the 50 line means that more managers thought it was going to be worse next year versus better. So we historically, when this ISM PMI index is above 50, the economy tends to move faster than when it's below 50. Now, there's a lot of hand waving in forecasting circles about whether or not you can actually put a percentage change to a change in the economy or not. But generally, this signals two things simultaneously. Is one, the outlook of these purchasing managers about what demand looks like. So if things are going to get better, they're probably foreseeing higher demand levels, which means there's going to be more revenue, which means there's going to be more growth in manufacturing. If they're seeing more pessimism or they feel like they're more pessimistic about the future, it not only suggests the opposite of what I just said, but it also suggests we won't see as much hiring. So that's the trickiness, is whether or not that little click up here is actually saying, well, maybe we're bottoming out on the pessimistic aspects of what's going on in manufacturing as a signal of what's going on in the macroeconomy. But it's been lingering under that red line for some time, which suggests that we're just sort of sputtering along. And the forecast will kind of, in a second, tell that story. But this is another one to watch and see if we don't, specifically for manufacturers, whether or not internally in the industry you're actually seeing that pessimism or optimism. But then second, what that means in terms of portending change in the macroeconomy. So these data come from the Federal Reserve in Philadelphia, and every quarter they interview 40 forecasters and ask them a bunch of questions about variables that they're looking at. And I pull 3 variables out because I think in essence, these are the 3 most important variables. They don't really ask them an interest rate forecast per se. So I pull out real GDP growth. They're thinking our income growth as an economy after inflation is considered, the unemployment rate as one sort of lick of the finger and where the wind's blowing about labor markets, but it's something that most people watch. It's almost like gas prices. It's not a great metric about what's going on, but it's something that consumers and businesses will sometimes react to because it's very easy to understand in terms of how it might affect the economy to come. And then that same core PCE inflation data going forward for the next few years. So these are annual averages about where these forecasters see the future. And these data are actually post-election in the sense that they knew what was coming in terms of the presidential administration, and they had the Q4 data in hand when they made these predictions. So if we look at GDP growth, these forecasters saw more optimism in 2025 and 2026 than the previous quarter's forecast. So in each one of these cases, the new, which I will shade in each case, column is the current Q4 of 2024 forecast looking forward to 2028 when the data were available. And then the previous column just left of it was the last quarter's forecast for the same dates. So you can see there's a little bit more optimism about 25 and 26, less about 27. We didn't have a 2028 forecast last quarter, but if you look at those data, none of that is suggesting immense growth nor a slip toward recession. And I'll come back and wrap on that in just a second. The unemployment rate is part of this story in the sense that we don't expect a surge in the unemployment rate, and it's been sort of wobbly over the last couple of quarters. The key there is, what's the genesis of that? Is the genesis of that demand or supply? So if there's very few people coming onto the labor market, perhaps because we're aging as a society, perhaps because there's enough housing and equity market wealth that people who have left the labor force don't necessarily have an economic incentive to jump back in. Is that what's holding up, or is it in fact that we're seeing demand continue to sort of pulsate forward in such a way that whoever comes on market basically is demanded, so we have relatively stable demand and supply conditions? That's what these numbers suggest over the next few years. But the concern is when it's the supply side of it, if you want to expand, where are you going to find the workers? And we'll come back and talk about that with respect to AI in just a bit. The core PCE data are the same ones we saw before. This is where they think things are going over the next couple of years. We're just going to slowly descend toward that blue dotted line I showed you in the price graph. Not much change there, but the slower descent of the inflation data then moves back toward real GDP and means that we will not see as fast a descent because inflation will remain elevated, and think of inflation as in the denominator of that ratio. If that is falling, we get a little bit of a purchasing power boost to the income we generate in the United States in terms of an inflation adjusted number. But when it's slower moving, it means it's going to be a drag on that purchasing power. So that might be part of the lack of optimism in some ways, that we just aren't seeing that decline as fast. And we maybe expect some productivity slowdown toward 26 and 27 that will then show its face in slower GDP numbers. The overarching idea is that we don't expect recession anytime soon, which is good in terms of a really high percentage, but we're watching really closely to see how monetary policy specifically sort of recalibrates against the changes in inflation and the downturn that's now maybe peaked or found its nadir, I should say, in the short term. We will find that out, and how much uncertainty is being sort of pushed out from the latest presidential administration. So we're watching all those vectors in terms of thinking about where the economy is going as macroeconomists. Now, when we start thinking about what we're seeing in the presidential administration, it's very easy. At my house, for example, we're like MSNBC West. I mean, it's everything at my house is just a news feed all day. And I've told my wife she's got to do 1 hour max watching TV and what's the headlines and get off of her phone. I think that's good advice for everybody, but that's just me. What we're going to try to do here in the next couple of minutes is break down what economists are seeing in terms of what the Trump administration is likely to do as specific to manufacturing as we can foresee. So the first is that if we see continued tariff expansion and or new ones created, we should expect that that's really trying, actually, believe it or not, to boost up manufacturing in the United States in some ways. And it's sometimes hard to see that through the fog of war, but it is in fact something to think about, where they want that to happen inside the White House. Now, they're also parallel to that trying to figure out immigration deportation, which has a detrimental effect on the labor force in the short term. It can boost in the medium term if people reemerge in the labor force and want to take the jobs left behind by a deported labor force. So the game in town in terms of the mixed economic outcomes of tariffs and deportation policy, or let's say immigration policy more generally, is what does that provide? So last couple of days have been somewhat dramatic in terms of two items. Is one we saw, like I said earlier, the House has passed a bill, which we don't know will pass the Senate and it has to pass in basically its current form, I believe, or it won't make it. How that's going to affect the tariff structures that go forward in terms of a way of generating revenue and also acting as a policy lever. And the second is how aggressive we will see changes in immigration policy, things like, providing a so-called gold card to relatively wealthy, quote unquote, entrepreneurs that want to come into the United States, where it could be a real mixed bag of entrepreneurs and people who not necessarily have that intent when they get American citizenship through that purchase. So we will see how all that goes. That's basically a subcategory of immigration policy. The current tax structure, like I said, will depend on what happens in the budget. We will see if that holds, but there's a lot of pressure in the White House because they talked about this throughout the campaign to push corporate taxes down and really kind of change the code and move everybody down a little bit. And this is why you're hearing a lot of budget cuts, because it's really meant to rebalance that without it really juicing the need to push more debt on the open market. And then what we don't know, though, from a manufacturing standpoint, because all the above have sort of a mix, but maybe net positive on manufacturing. If government contracts change and move toward a very limited amount of individual corporations, how does that affect manufacturing writ large if those contracts from the government shrink up? And what we don't know, for example, is that the rhetoric in Europe is actually going to create a larger marketplace, because you'll see European economies suddenly want to buy more defense and aerospace products, but will they buy it from the United States under a change in tariffs and or the politics of buying American, though we are kind of a large market for munitions and for aerospace technologies, whether or not they'll just continue to develop their own. And they have obviously on board in Europe quite a bit of possibilities to fulfill demand. We will see how much of that comes out of the next stage of how Europe and the United States interact under NATO. For manufacturers, we should expect rising costs. We should expect wages are going to pick up. The net of all these effects have got to be to kind of keep costs elevated in the end. That uncertain political environment can lead to a lot of nervousness, especially if you have a warm labor market. You might see workers looking for whatever opportunities they can for stability. So watch for that. But it seems likely that defense and aerospace, in terms of a manufacturing sub-industry, will continue to have sort of a drumbeat of demand as long as we've got relatively major conflicts happening. However, if the Ukrainian situation comes to a close, that might also slow that down, except for how Europe rearranges the way it looks as defense if we start to pull out as American support for what goes on in Europe. Okay. So with all that, let's wrap up a little bit. The interest rate forecast suggests that, believe it or not, we have kind of a net positive outcome in the sense that interest rates have fallen. Now, will they fall as fast? The answer is no, but will they continue to descend? And the answer is yes, just more slowly. Job openings in manufacturing are going to be, a drag on manufacturing. We'll see by how much. The forecast for GDP and sort of looking forward as far as American incomes, that still looks pretty good. So the drumbeat from the consumer should keep demand going. Will it be enough to support the current level of manufacturing, or will we see a shift within manufactured goods, especially if tariffs take hold and are sort of rearranging where we're looking to purchase goods and services? Maybe. So in net, we're expecting that to be positive. The ISM index we saw before, that PMI opinion poll, that basically is still a drag. Even though it's maybe bottomed out, we still think it's a drag because it lives under that red dotted line. So inflation has faded, but it has stalled in terms of its descent. We're thinking about interest rates along that side. Uncertainty in policy is never good. So one of the sort of overarching things to take from the macro forecast is that we do not like uncertainty in the macro economy, especially with policymakers. Can we see manufacturing gain here in the United States if we slowly disjoin from Europe and there's sort of global demand that means American manufacturers would see a pickup? Maybe. We will see. It really depends on the politics of European nations purchasing from the American economy in an unknown tariff environment. And the optimism is still there. The next quarter should really tell a tale about how much the current policies are starting to, or at least the current policy framework and what it looks like going forward is starting to weigh on forecasters' minds, either negatively or positively. So there's going to be a lot of bated breath around the next forecast coming out. And that Philadelphia Federal Reserve forecast is really like a blue chip forecast. It just comes out as a direct insert into the Federal Reserve's book when they think about what's happening in the macroeconomy. And that's why I tend to use that one, because it should give you a real inkling about policy change to come. What I want to do now is look at a few manufacturing industry indicators that I tend to watch. The first one is what's going on with oil prices. So if you watch the pump price, things have picked up a little bit, but in general, the trend has been down from the peak after the pandemic. So these data are monthly from January 1990 forward on a seasonally adjusted basis. And you can kind of see the peaks in oil prices and barrel prices. And this is specific to West Texas Intermediate crude and not Brent, but Brent in terms of the European price for crude oil per barrel is basically highly correlated. So we're talking about the same phenomena. Off we go toward the 2020s, and then we had a lot of craziness around the pandemic, and now it's kind of settled in. In a lot of ways, we basically are where we probably would have been anyway, and you can kind of see there's a sort of a long-term average that's been established. I might be able to show you with my arrow here after the Great Recession, and we're basically right there. So this is the CPI index. That's the core index. Same thing we saw with the PCE, but much more of a consumer survey rather than an attempt to measure all the goods and services we buy minus food and energy products. You can see how tied sometimes or non-tied to oil prices that CPI tends to be. Since the pandemic, it's been very closely tied. So one of the things that economists get asked all the time is, well, why do we look at core and why don't we use energy prices or food prices as really part of our analysis? And the idea is that the volatility in those prices, you can kind of see that through the 2010s, might lead to policy decisions you don't want to make in terms of having long-term shaping of financial markets and or of the macroeconomy. But since the pandemic, they have been very correlated with each other. And you can see that there in terms of their decline, where they're headed, and kind of how one is feeding off the other a little bit. And intuitively, that seems right. But watch for that as we go forward in terms of where oil prices go, especially, again, if we see some stasis in Europe and specifically in Ukraine with respect to the war, and it sort of slowly comes to an end. How does that rearrange petroleum markets? Because now Russian economy can come back online. And how are all the other oil producing nations going to look at that in terms of an intrusion of supply? Okay. These are producer price indices for manufacturing. That's the total sort of price index for manufacturers in the United States. And these data are the same timeline, January 1990 through December 2024. You can see the 4 recessions that have taken place since January 1990. You can see this sort of long-term trend upswing and then the real surge after the pandemic and then this flat period. So one of the things about any business in the United States, but manufacturing being kind of the stalwart, sort of how forecasters and macroeconomists think about the driver in the macroeconomy, is that prices are elevated in terms of the cost of inputs and the cost of manufacturing goods. And they don't look like they're going to come back down with strength anytime soon, which means we may have moved up to another permanent level very quickly versus this long-term trend of increases in cost we've seen over the last basically 35 years. Now, if you start breaking it down, this is the PPI for metals. So if you use precious metals in manufacturing, or you just think about things like aluminum, tin, et cetera, in terms of manufacturing, that has also elevated and looks very similar. That's a major driver in that PPI overall. This is machines and equipment pricing, same deal. Industrial commodities, same deal. And then construction costs. And the reason I put construction costs in here is because construction is kind of a funny sort of complementary industry in terms of how macroeconomists look at the macroeconomy, and how construction also then is a major customer of manufacturing. Those costs are also elevated. They feed off of each other to a certain extent. So all those cost elevations then start moving into other metrics. For example, new orders in manufacturing have been somewhat suppressed from the peak. So if you see the weaving of new orders vis-a-vis the increase in the producer price of manufacturing, that they're very tied to each other. And new orders, the one thing that's good, and I'll come back to this when I wrap up in just a second, has flattened out a little bit in terms of their downhill slide, but are not turning the corner yet. And for inventories, we're actually starting to see inventory sell-offs, with the idea that if we're not getting new orders and we still have demand, now we're starting to remove inventories. And that leads to a really mixed bag of effects on manufacturers, especially in terms of holding on to workers. And this is another reason why we're seeing those job openings starting to slide. The combination of these factors mean, we're kind of resetting vis-a-vis where we were, let's say, 2.5 years ago in terms of the post-pandemic world and what that means going forward. So one of the topics we wanted to talk about today was AI. In the fourth quarter of 2024, the Minnesota through in Minneapolis Fed did a survey of Midwestern manufacturers. And they said, hey, in the last year, what have you done from an automation standpoint? And these answers were provided. So a majority of them had no change in terms of their current automation. A bunch of them said yes to 5 major items: increased productivity, the mitigation of labor shortages. In other words, you can't find workers, so you move to automation instead. You reduce labor cost in the sense that maybe instead of hiring, you could have hired, but you didn't, and you put a machine in place. To improve product quality, in other words, just trying to figure out a way of maybe making sure that there's a little bit more QA there. Improve worker safety, great. So those are some reasons why we saw that go in. But if you look at the bottom where that arrow is, they actually putting in AI by name was a very small change. So one of the funny things about AI is it's so futuristic, it can really capture people's imaginations. But from a corporate standpoint and putting it in, there is going to be a push and pull weirdness to it, in that workers are going to be very concerned that the implementation of AI should really be seen as a complement to them and not as a substitute. So that might lead to some sort of, let's say, owner resistance to push AI quickly if they even know how they want to do it, to then sort of capture those other pieces. But one could easily say that what AI is meant to do is capture those other reasons why you would change your automation level. So at a sort of corporate strategy level, what AI in manufacturing should be considered is sort of thinking about, well, this is a sort of an evolution of innovation. We want to capture whatever gains we can from that. So we purport to have an innovation culture. Let's use AI as a way of really saying, okay, here's our statement about how we're innovative. We also think that, okay, well, if I can't find workers, or I'm concerned about having these job openings linger, and I can't find anyone that actually is trained up and I can put in there and do the job at the wage I want to pay, do I shrink my workforce and then look at AI as a way of complementing the current workforce in such a way that I actually grow by shrinking what I would have been otherwise? So that shrink and invest is one of the classic strategies that are out there in corporate America, but AI is allowing that to happen slightly differently for the following 2 reasons. Most AI that is in place right now is generative, meaning that it's taking current information sets, machine learning from those, and just from a statistical standpoint, basically grinding toward the minimum error possible from the modeling of what phenomena should happen based on the question you asked, and grinding it down to where we minimize the error in that statement. That in essence is what, in 30 seconds or less, what machine learning is trying to do. However, that's generative AI. What's got people stomach ache about this is what we call predictive AI. If we can model human behavior, we can replace humans in a lot of different cases. And we think of the evolution of robotics, and we think about what robotics can be programmed to do by a programmer, in a way of just sort of saying, okay, well, now I can use a joystick and move the robot around in a certain setting, or I can program it to do certain tasks. If the robot can learn from the environment, think about how powerful that would be in terms of, I can't find workers, let me put this robot there, and the robot will figure out things that will actually optimize based on the generative AI inside, that is now also mocking in a predictive way what a human would do, because it's learning at a faster rate and much more about the way it's seeing other humans around them and what they're doing, and learning from that too, on the fly. Not data we already know, but data it's gaining access to on the move. That's where things get more scary. So when you think about AI in manufacturing, think about those items. It has not had a lot of adoption recently in terms of manufacturing going through this wild evolution, but we do expect it to continue to move in, and especially if robotics become more perfective along the side of predictive AI, change is coming big time. So new orders are giving a signal that's relatively mixed. We will see if it starts to curl up a little bit, because we see more move toward manufacturing. As I said right off the top, the idea of the Trump White House is to actually juice manufacturing through a lot of these policies, because that was a big campaign promise. Inventories have slipped a little bit, which tells a story about, well, if the orders aren't there, but the demand's there, we have inventories on hand, we're going to start liquidating. That same ISM PMI index, that tells a story about pessimism more than optimism for now. And the macro forecasts, as we saw earlier, are somewhat mixed. So What does that mean looking forward? We don't expect recession, but really watch those tax and tariff environments. Will lower tax rates juice more investment and ultimately more hiring? That's a bet that Congress and the White House are making if they pass the current budget legislation. Will general uncertainty really overrule that in the sense that will equity markets finally say, okay, enough is enough. I have no idea where we're going, and I'm going to take the profits off the table. The Trump White House is also very concerned of the stock market as being a major metric of their own performance. So watch that, and also watch when you start hearing rhetoric about what's going to happen with respect to the Federal Reserve and how much pressure they're going to have on them if they don't start moving rates down, because lower rates are good for investors. We've seen that fade, and it's likely to continue. We've seen that leveling out of new orders. So watch for that in terms of what that really means. Like I said, the interest rates may or may not be falling faster, depending on pressure and other data. But for right now, the forecasts look like that we're starting to see a slowdown in what the original interest rate trajectory was going to be. And that optimism piece, will it continue? Will manufacturers see more optimism going forward, given the mix of policies and maybe a turn of the corner in some ways with respect to manufacturing demand worldwide, with potential copper tariffs coming on? That's going to be another tough little blow too. So we're going to see how much pushback the White House gets if they start to do things like that. So Jameek, with that, I will stop sharing here and I will hand it back over to you. Folks, thank you again so much for your time. Hopefully this is helpful for you.
Dr. Eiler, thank you so much for your presentation. Obviously, as a amateur, like layperson economist and just fan of it in general, it's always fascinating to hear from you. So I
Thank
absolutely.
you.
What I'll do is, obviously we have time, and I wanted to make sure we took time for Q&A. I have some questions here, but I really wanted to open it up to the group to ask first. For those who are on, feel free to unmute and ask away. I think Dr. Eiler is a pretty magnanimous question answerer as far as his presentations go. So I'll leave,
Any questions? Good. Let it rip.
yeah, I'll leave some room for free to ask, and if not, I can certainly ask a question just to get us started. And then we have a decent number of people in here today, which is actually really nice. But
Jameek, why don't you go ahead and ask a question and
yeah,
see if that doesn't stimulate some things?
yeah. We've, again, feel free to ask or put it in the chat. But in the meantime, I'll ask something. So really, my first question is for automation, right? Like we're we're seeing in our industries in the rebate strategies community that it's become an increasingly like commonly used tool, right? And I guess there was a split as you saw in that survey, right? The results were pretty mixed of how people feel about it, right? And so my question to you
Yep.
is, do we see that companies who are embracing that automation are doing better or doing differently? Like, is there a benefit that we're seeing from companies that embrace it?
Yeah, not one that I would say is discernible yet. So, and I think that that mixed set of indicators tells the story that manufacturers specifically, but really in general, those that could employ automation quickly and or using AI, it has not been obvious that the gains are there yet.
Mhm.
In terms of a split, right? We don't really have a good control and treatment in the sense
Yeah.
we no one's done that. I don't think I haven't seen it yet. A study that suggests here's 100 firms in this industry that have no AI, and here's 100 that have adopted AI in a bunch of different ways. Are we actually seeing a positive change for the treatment group that actually has adopted AI, and but basically has the same structure otherwise as the 100 that we had as our base? Uh, you have to expect though that people who adopt AI and keep it are seeing benefits, or they would walk away from it. At least from an economic standpoint, that's the reason you adopt it, is because you see the efficiencies. If you keep it, it's because you're generating efficiencies.
Yeah.
The one thing to think about is how much do automation, how much do the practices of automating and using things like artificial intelligence, how do they look to replace what a worker would do? So in some cases, workers are just seen more as a softer touch, maybe on a manufactured product or on any product or service, than something that is going to be less, by definition, less personable. And that might be, or just less, like I said before, more robotic in the way
Yeah.
they're going to go about it, almost by definition. It's the predictive thing that actually is where it's going to probably split. Where if I can start acting like a human in my interactions with people and how I go about my business inside the facility, that's where it's going to be a little bit more on the borderline of, wow, okay, do I hire somebody because I need this done, or do I use this new robot? And
Yeah.
how costly is the technology to adopt? So there's still a lot of variables running around about those kind of decisions. And I don't believe that there's been, let's say, one set of studies or one industry you could point to and say, okay, you can easily tell that the value is there with the adoption yet.
So it feels like we're still in the early adopter phase, right? It's and
I think so. But the funny thing about it is that automation is not new.
yeah.
It's just morphing into this new form, or a form that complements automation that already exists. So the key is whether or not the new innovations are going to in fact enhance what's already there, or will it kind of plateau and say, okay, until we go to this next form, we're really not going to get the gains we expected. That's really the kind of the game in town right now, and that is even addressing the regulatory environment that's like, or may come or not, with respect to predictive AI and how if it starts to replace people in theory, if we want to, if lawmakers are going to try to get in front of that.
And so I think that's a really good point, right? We're talking about AI, right? And I think when people think of AI initially, it's either the Terminator or it's something that's coming to take your job, right?
That's right. That's
Automation
right.
is really AI is really an extension of automation practices that are old, right? Like this is a principle that we've been adopting and using in manufacturing and retailing and really in every facet of the economy for years now. And I think that you're right. While we're looking at we're just at the beginning of the inflection point, right? To be able
I
to
think so. I mean, that 2 years ago, that was kind of the bet that was made when you saw a bunch of AI companies pop up as AI. That they morphed out of, or they split, or were sort of tangentially connected to Microsoft, Meta, Google, you name it, where they were just a branch off and say, we're going to spin off this AI lab and kind of see how far we can push it. Right. So, in that sense, if you think about it as an inflection point, when the investment dollars are moving that direction, somebody seeing the value
yeah,
of the science and where it's going. So, the key is that inflection, does it go exponential, or does it increase at a decreasing rate? And that's the game right now, is that Wall Street is kind of bet on the exponential outcome,
yeah,
but maybe it's starting to inflect again.
plateau. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and if it starts to increase at a decreasing rate, does that start to take profits off the table and start to push investors away in mass that would have been there otherwise? And that's always true with technologies. The investors love the exponential growth. When it starts to plateau, they want out.
They went out because they're looking for the next exponential
They're looking
growth.
for the next big thing. You got it exactly.
Um, awesome. If there's nothing, if there are no other questions, I have more questions here for you. So obviously
Sure.
your presentations are very detailed and you go through a lot of graphs, right? And a lot of kind of economic indices and indicators. My question to you is, if you had to pick one, if you had to do your presentation, but you had to just do one of your slides, what to you is the most important slide?
Well, I think the most important slide, because it allows you to discuss a lot of things at once, is the forecast. Is where I had real GDP, the unemployment rate, and core PCE inflation, sort of the three major macro variables. But it's missing one, and that's the interest rate environment.
Hmm.
So, as an economist, or more specifically as a macroeconomist, my take is that the interest rate environment is the most important thing to watch, because it's really the nexus of the way we think about how we consume and save. So, from the household standpoint, how we think about growth and the cost of growth as a corporation, how we think about growing as a government, because if we have to finance that growth, what's it going to cost us to do that? And we're having a lot of discussions right now, and we have been for the last 10 or 15 years, about debt growth in the United States and having our fiscal budgets shocked by an increase in our interest payments that we have to pay to keep the debt current. So the interest rate environment to me is the most important macro metric out there, and because it affects the other ones, and of course the other ones somewhat affect it too. But to me, that controlling the interest rate environment is really the best way of shaping the labor market, the way consumers look at buying goods and services, and thus how prices will ultimately evolve as a result of those two decisions. So this is why we get so much focus on the Federal Reserve and what it's going to do next, because it affects equity markets, it affects households, it affects corporate decisions, and also affects government decisions, all in one shot. And hence, we're kind of all trained as economists to think the interest rate is the most important.
Love that. And as somebody who purchased his home in 2021, I feel like the interest rate discussion is just a fascinating thing to me, right? To see like where we are 4 years ago, 3 years ago to now, right? Is
Yeah.
um all right, so I think we have room for one or two more questions. Again, and if anybody's on the call who wants to ask a question, feel free to jump over me. Then you can throw it into the chat. I mean, I'll read it out, or you can just ask aloud. But I know you touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to see if I can get you to expand. Obviously, the rebate strategist community is made up of, we're talking about the United States, right? United States policy, United States economics, but the rebate strategist community is global, right? So we have
Hmm.
people from across the supply chain, across the country, across the world. And so my question to you is, how do you see, kind of on a deeper level, some of these trends influencing the wider global economy? Like the kind of the uncertainty environment that we're in now, how does that translate to the global market?
Yeah, I think it comes in two ways. One is if you look at how the current White House has thought about the use of tariffs in a way that's more of a policy lever, and it seems like that the situation is this: we're going to suggest that if you don't come to the table to try to renegotiate something or to negotiate something that I want, I'm going to use my market power to impose this change on you that is going to be at least perceived as maybe in your country as a relatively hard outcome. So that then forces a change at the negotiation table, and then I pull back that policy. But that can lead to a lot of ups and downs in terms of decision making. So a really good most recent example of this is the copper tariff. So if there's a tariff on copper and you think about how many things, especially in the manufacturing world, that use copper as an input, or how much of the inputs we have use copper to then come and help us manufacture goods, and also for consumers, how much copper is in the things we use. Uh, that can easily shock a lot of different supply chains in ways that we don't like, and just beyond, let's say, the Chilean economy, which is a key copper producer. So if you look at that and you say, okay, wow, what's that mean in terms of how they're thinking? Well, what's the logic as to why you'd want to do that market in specific? It's hard to understand that without a little bit more context. And when your president comes out and says the context is it's self-evident, or the context is because I'm smart and I think this is the way it should be, or we're trying to get a negotiation. The end game of all this is hard to understand because the explanations are very pithy and quick
Yeah.
without a lot of depth, right? So that's kind of part one, thinking on the global side. Are there any global markets that aren't potentially targets for this sort of, you know, tariff threat, negotiation, remove tariff? Or if you impose tariff, do you have a retaliatory tariff that actually exacerbates the global trade issues?
Yeah.
Right. So that environment where we just have, I have no idea. I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and find out that we actually now have a new tariff on us from all over the world. The second is what's going on in Europe. And to me, that second part is actually the more important. If we start walking away from NATO and the security of Europe, or let's just say the sense that there is a transatlantic way of thinking about European security that is, you know, ironclad post-war. This is the way we want the quote unquote free world to act, and that devolves. That's a problem that could easily affect the way we trade with Europe, the way that Europe looks at us, and I suggested this earlier, as a place for goods and services that help them defend themselves, looks at us as an inbound user of European goods and services when our troops are there or when our diplomats are there, and also what the role is in terms of Russia in the greater European economy. It's hard to believe that we can trust what happens in Russia after what's happened in Ukraine, in terms of, you know, I think, and I talked about this a lot when Russian invasion took place in Ukraine, is doesn't this move Russia into a pariah status that is going to be very hard to unwind without regime change in Russia? So assuming there's no regime change in Russia, how do we have all this problem, 3 years plus of people being killed, which seems like for very little gain or reason other than, Russian hegemony they're trying to show off in that part of the world. How does Europe and Russia how do they come back to each other? That's, to me, one of the biggest things in terms of, let's say, global uncertainty, even and manufacturing wise as well. What's that going to mean in terms of trade relations, of input commodity relations, and really thinking forward about how Europe is a market in both directions, how the US is a market for Europe.
It's a great point, right? Is how do we reintegrate Gazprom into the like European like energy to society essentially, right? Like how do you manage that? That's really good thinking. Now we actually have
Mhm.
a question from a user, from a member,
Mhm.
Kim Gillis. So Kim, I don't mind reading this out for you because I know you put it into the chat. When thinking about global manufacturing markets, so Europe, China, rest of Asia, what indicators and sources of those indicators should we be watching?
I should be watching two items. Is one, what is happening to the global price of inputs? In the sense that when you're thinking about other markets, what are they facing as potential issues in terms of global inputs and cost pressures that they may have? And the second is watching bilateral trade. So the one thing about tariffs, or let's just say a changing trade environment, is that some of it may be rhetoric, and some of it may have, like, let's say, a small change in the overall flow. And it really kind of depends on how the new protection policies are imposed. But if you start to see a shift that looks trend, or let's say is a trend shift in the trade relations where imports and exports are moving specifically for manufactured goods in ways that you did not predict otherwise, then the policies that you have either in the United States or in a sort of tit for tat way that are retaliatory because the US imposed something and then the other country felt like that they had to do the same to try to balance it out and say, okay, if you do this, we're going to do that. So let's walk back and kind of reset. How that then bleeds into the flow of goods and services, especially inputs into processes that we need in some ways in a lot of manufacturing. And this is not just in the US, but also global to continue to flow to make sure that we can deliver products. So watching commodities prices and really kind of as a driver of what we see in overall cost pressures and then watching the flow of trade. Those are kind of the two things I think about when I think about global trade in manufacturing and what are some metrics to see how whatever uncertainty there is actually being realized in markets. So I put a lot more focus the last 6 or 8 months just in general on what's going on with commodities prices, just because there's been so much consternation around things like copper, gold, to a certain extent, things like platinum. You're seeing investors look at different metals as a way of shifting how they hold portfolio assets. And what's that mean in terms of providing even more uncertainty to the folks that use those as part of their inputs in their process, in their manufacturing processes? So those would be the two things I would watch: commodities prices and what's going on with bilateral trade, especially with larger manufacturing countries.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Dr. Allen. Thank you for the
Kim, I
question.
hope that helps.
Yeah. And with that, I know we have 5 minutes left. But I think that now is probably a good time to close up shop unless there are any other last second questions. As usual, Dr. Eiler, great presentation. Appreciate your insight, your thoughts. I think this is obviously a perfect combination of just current events, really the issues in the supply chain, and kind of what we're looking at over the next couple of years of trading relationships, right? So I
Mhm.
really appreciate your insight here.
Of course.
And this is recorded, so we'll post a recording in the next day or so into the Rebate Strategist community for anybody who wants to review, or see if any of those who missed. But again, thank you. Thank you to everybody who attended today. We'll close up for now, and we'll see you guys for our next call for your community next month. Be on the lookout for the announcement.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you all.